Amanda. I'm just going to briefly introduce the remote sensing tools that I've developed to map wetland hydrology. This is really a non-technical presentation, and the methods are pretty complex, so if anyone has any questions afterwards, I'd be happy to talk with you later. So the two main issues that we faced when starting this project, as Amanda mentioned, are first, the existing data sets were insufficient. The National Wetland Inventory was the primary data set available to us, and although it has good coverage, it really lacks good hydrologic information, certainly not enough for what we were trying to do. There were some field data sets available, but again, they lacked any temporal richness, and they were very small in extent. So that's part of the reason we had this large field campaign to get more wetland data, but we wanted to supplement that with remote sensing, wetland hydrologic data collected through remote sensing techniques. And again, those techniques available at the time were inadequate for mapping wetland hydrology. The primary reasons were that the temporal resolution is often very limited. Techniques looked at change between 2 or 3 dates, and that's not enough information to get at the hydrologic regime of a wetland. And the spatial resolution is just too coarse. And this is a very common problem in remote sensing that tends to use satellite imagery. For example, Landsat satellite imagery has a pixel resolution of just 30 meters, and that's not fine enough to detect changes in surface water area for smaller water bodies such as wetlands. So that was what my task was, to try and come up with new methods to tackle this problem. And I have to say, I couldn't find a one-size-fits-all method. I had to develop methods differently on our sites on the west side from the sites on the east side in the Columbia Plateau. And I'll go over those in a second. So for the west side, essentially I combined 2 fairly new remote sensing tools. The first is pattern recognition, and it's very different than traditional remote sensing, which tends to use the color or the spectral signature of a pixel. Instead, pattern recognition tries to mimic the way that humans recognize patterns by including additional features such as context, shape, texture. I combine this with a 3D mapping tool, LiDAR, which allows us to see the environment in 3D and is hugely important for understanding wetland hydrology, because we can not only see how the water moves through the environment, but also where the water pools, which is really important for wetlands. So I'll just show you how combining these 2 tools together looks like. Most of the products are LiDAR derived. I don't know if you can see this one well, but it's a digital terrain model combined with a canopy surface model. And then I use several dates of aerial imagery, some of the hydrologic flow modeling, and all of these are inputted into the computer, and the computer searches through all these data input layers to look for patterns, which it then delineates, and that's what you have here with these blue lines. It's actually looking for similarities within all the individual pixels and delineating them into polygons. And now that they're objects, I can train the computer to recognize what I'm interested in, which in this case were the components of a wetland, ponded water, and emergent vegetation, as well as small streams and canopy cover. So this is the data set I created for Mount Rainier, and the really cool thing about remote sensing is now that I have this algorithm developed, I can then expand it across the entire park. And it can also be used in other areas that have good LiDAR data. But it's important for us because we can now take Seiyun's model data and scale it up for the entire park. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of LiDAR data on the east side, so I had to come up with a different method. And what we do have on the east side are a lot of cloud-free sunny days. And so I was able to have this idea to combine high-resolution imagery with a time series of Landsat satellite imagery. And the idea was by combining these two data sets together, I could preserve the high spatial resolution of the aerial imagery while adding that temporal component of the time series of Landsat satellite imagery going back to 1983. And so this is what I did, and essentially reconstructed a water surface area hydrograph for every wetland within my study areas. This is a wetland here. You can see in the images in the right-hand corner, it's actually the wetland on the right, and that wetland has slowly dried up since 1983, and you can see that in the hydrograph. On the x-axis, you have the years, but you also have the observations from the satellite and the tick marks. And for this particular wetland, I had over 240 observations, so really a lot of data to build a fairly robust data set to hand over to Se-Yoon for her modeling efforts. So every wetland has an individual hydrograph, but I can also take this data and summarize it to the landscape scale. And this is just an example of that, where I am able to look at the percentage of years that a wetland dried between 1983 and 2011. This is useful to trying to determine the different types of wetlands. You can see the blue dots represent those that are more permanently flooded. They don't tend to dry out. You can see that on the image in the bottom right. And then you have wetlands that are very ephemeral. They almost dry out every year, which is the red dots or the wetland on the bottom left. And if we want to look at how the hydrographs vary for a particular season, we can bring up an individual year and look at how the hydrograph for these three wetlands. So that's the figure on the right, where you can see that permanently flooded wetland really isn't changing very much. Where that ephemeral wetland, as soon as the snow melts, it's drying very quickly. And I just want to make this point very clear, because although I'm using Landsat satellite imagery, which has that pixel resolution of 30 meters, I'm still able to create data for very, very small wetlands, ones that might only make up one Landsat pixel. So this is a very ephemeral wetland that really only shows up in the wetter years. So putting all this together, I wanted to create a tool for wetland managers. And the thing on the east side is that there's a lot of other anthropogenic stressors on these wetlands. And so I think this data set really provides a lot more information. And this is just an example of two wetlands that are undergoing some sort of change. The one on the top has decreased by 50%. I'm not sure exactly of the cause, but if you looked at the groundwater data from wells around, you can see that there's a lot of groundwater mining. The wetland on the bottom is surrounded by farmland and is constantly plowed over pretty much every year, and you can see that it has a very unique hydrograph. Okay, so putting this all together, I wanted to create a tool that would summarize all of this information that I could hand to managers, and this is what I did in a geodatabase. Essentially, this is for my 3 study areas, and this is an idea that you can look across the landscape and see change. This is just showing the amount of change in surface water area from 1983 to 2011, where the red dots represent wetlands that have dried out quite a bit since 1983. You can see those in the west side in Douglas County, where some of the wetlands may be slightly increasing in size. But again, a lot of managers don't work at this scale, so I wanted to provide a tool where they could zoom in on an individual region and see wetlands and click on a particular wetland and get not only the historical hydrograph, but also the hydrograph under future climate projections. And that's more of what Se-Yoon's going to talk about today. Again, I just want to make the point with remote sensing, what makes it so cool is that because this algorithm is now developed, we can now expand to other parts of the Columbia Plateau, but also to other ecoregions as well. And with that, before I pass it on to Se-Yoon, I just want to thank a whole bunch of funders that have made this research possible and getting our work off the ground. So, thank you.